So good afternoon. I'm delighted.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me here. I think I was at least at one, maybe at a DIMAX workshop. I don't remember. If I came, I gave the caveat that I'm not a theoretician, and it makes me nervous to speak to a DIMAX crowd. I'll say it again. But as you notice, I am not in the general program. I'm in the Science and Technology Center program. So. I am a experimental computer scientist, very multidisciplinary, very applied, and I started out in internet protocol development out of grad school at MIT, and wandered into this space that we called wireless sensing or embedded sensing, and had the great opportunity. In 2000, I was on sabbatical and switching universities. You're not supposed to do that. And moved to UCLA. And before I'd even signed my letter of moving from USC to UCLA, I wrote a letter of intent to apply for a Science and Technology Center at NSF with collaborators there. And it was partly like finding those collaborators and folks interested in pursuing some of what I'll be talking about that really sealed the deal for me to make that move. It wasn't literally, I didn't move my home. I was living in West LA, but I did move my institution. So this is a talk that's around that center, and I indulged, and now you are going to be subject to a certain amount of nostalgia on my part of sort of going back and looking at the, excuse my expression, but I think we did some pretty cool shit in our time. So that's my summary remark. So the work itself in this Center for Embedded Sensing grew out of an ISAT study. So ISAT is still a board of DARPA that advises on sort of new directions, and I was on ISAT back in the day, and I proposed a study around, I think, what we called simple systems, which makes me laugh once we got into trying to make them work, and led to this area and my pursuit of this area of wireless sensing or distributed sensing. And through that ISAT process and then some early DARPA programs in the area, one of the things that I learned deeply as an experimentalist, not a theoretician in distributed sensing, was that there's sort of, it's not mine, I'm looking at my notes on my phone, sorry, is that there's nothing, in terms of experimental sensing systems and sensing, it's not an abstract endeavor. So when I was doing internet protocols, the name of the game was abstraction, modularity, and being really agnostic to the applications that could grow on top, which is how we ended up with all the amazing things and some of the horrendous ways in which the internet is now being put to use. But we built this modular, minimal assumption system on top of which people could take advantage of the huge reach and scalability of that internet to build all kinds of things. So it was very good that the core of the internet, routing and congestion control and all those things, were relatively application agnostic. And I had come from internet protocol stuff. I just decided, okay, time to move from developing protocols for routers and move to developing protocols for other distributed things. That's what I thought in my simplistic notion what distributed sensing would be. But distributed sensing is about sensing the physical world. And that is difficult to do in the abstract and dangerous to do in the abstract for an experimentalist. It's possible, as a theoretician, you can do things that are more generalizable, but as an experimentalist, it's really different to design a distributed sensing system to measure and adjust light and temperature in a smart building, like this maybe isn't, but would be someday, than it is to do it out in an ecosystem in a rainforest to maybe learn the dynamics of what happens in subtle changes in climate change to what's going on in a battlefield. And so I was motivated to develop this Center for Embedded Sensing And the NSF STC program let me do that, or imagine doing it, because that's all I was doing when I applied, right? I and my colleagues were just imagining. We didn't really think that first round we'd actually get through each of those phases. Each phase of the process, the letter of intent and the pre-proposal and the full proposal and the site visit, and the response in each of those things, I would just say, okay, we're just going to spend more time before we fail. Like, this is just drawing us farther down that path of doing more because we didn't think it was likely to happen. But what we imagined wanting to do was, because we didn't see embedded sensing as an abstract notion, I wanted to get the ecologists and the environmental engineers under the same tent as the computer scientists and electrical engineers, and eventually the statisticians also, and to do this together. So that's what we ended up doing over the course of 10, 11 years. Lots of faculty, lots of graduate students, lots of undergrads, lots of high school interns even, research staff, so essential to building that glue to actually be able to build systems that let the user and the developer of a technique meet in the middle. And it was a really great run. I don't know, any of you know Andy Van Dam, right? So he ran one of the early centers. So about 4 years into this process, Andy visited UCLA, and I can still close my eyes and see it sitting across the desk from him, and he said, Deborah, just so you know, the day my center ended was the most traumatic day of my professional career. Okay, so I proceeded to wake up every morning, because I am a worrier, thinking, okay, right? 6 years out, 5 years out, 4 years out, right? How am I going to manage this? I think I largely just managed my expectations, and I was somewhat braced for it. So at our environmental monitoring, environment as in the physical environment, both above and below ground and underwater, became our sort of, as we used to say in the day, our killer application suite. And we chose it because, and we were asked many times, why did you choose these applications? And we chose them and stuck with them for the most part because they had the amount of spatial variability that they needed something other than the available technologies of the day. The available technologies of the day were remote sensing, which now, you know, the resolution of remote sensing is better and better. But still, the scientists wanted to be able to make observations within a pixel of whatever remote sensing could do. And then there was, you know, sort of hand samples and hand-placed measurements, which didn't provide you any temporal, longitudinal view of a particular phenomenon. So these environmental monitoring applications needed what we were developing. They weren't just a context or an excuse for it. And they were important, have only become more important over time as we face environmental changes and need to understand the dynamics of an ecosystem where subtle changes can, subtle inputs can lead to large changes in outputs. So terrestrial, we did other things. We did seismic, we did a range of things, but if I choose one, terrestrial ecology really demonstrated, and we had done this slide at the end of Sen, so I could go back and grab it out from my PowerPoints, that terrestrial ecology story really gave us this dynamic between what was studied and the technology that we built to do it. And some really interesting things along the way. In the upper left, that's a camera in a bird's nest. So we were doing embedded sensing. We were using imagers as sensors of biological processes. Here we were studying ecosystems, and we didn't have a single biological sensor. All we had were proxies for measuring things around biology, and imagers were the best of those. So we could use imagers to capture the change in state of a biological process, a bird hatching, or the greening up, right? The greening up of an ecosystem, when do the leaves start to appear, right? You can measure that in the cameras that started to be placed all over physical environments, and we used that with the elementary forms of computer vision at the time to use the imager as a proxy sensor. we started out being very committed to the smallest of devices and smart dust and all of that. And through the course of the center and a lot of going back and forth between the lab, which for computer scientists and such is meaning sitting in front of their desktop at the time and then laptop and such, and out into the field, and then taking that data and being back on the analysis side. And during that time, we realized that we might have had this dream of thousands of distributed nodes doing this massively, over deploying them so that they could robustly do directed diffusion of data, right? It's a beautiful concept. I love it. I have like some, with my co-authors, some crazy number of citations to that paper. And that work was very interesting intellectually, but never happened. And SENS taught me that. It never happened because over deploying sensors in this context, in this time frame of work, doesn't happen. There's interference between sensors. There's cost to sensors. There's all kinds of reasons that in this domain. And so we did the sort of non-academic thing, but I think the right thing in terms of mission-driven work. And we said, okay, we're giving up on this definition of what makes it an interesting computer science problem, or the most interesting computer science problem, from one perspective, and we're going to go in the direction of what makes it more true to the mission, and then look and find where are the hard problems there for the computer scientists and folks to still solve. That move, when you're committed to mission-driven research, is a hard one to make. And I would say, I don't think I made too many enemies during the course of my time as a center director, but if I made some, it was always in that direction. And I think even my NSF program managers were not particularly happy with my commitment to the mission. If I wanted to make an alliteration, I could say they weren't happy in my commitment to the mission over the math. But that's definitely poetic license. Where am I? Okay, still just back here to say, but one of the things we did that, and then we were rewarded. Because in moving from sort of smart dust and the notion of massively distributed, and accepting the fact that we had limited numbers of instruments and such, one of the great things that happened along the way was Bill Kaiser started thinking about robotically moving sensors. So not all of them over there on the top left, you see that thing hanging between the trees, right? So we didn't have deployable drones and things at that time. But you could go and instrument an ecosystem and capture more of the volume of what was going on with a little bit of infrastructure, like the train tracks that I took to take the train here from New York. It works really well until you get to Newark, and then it's like that, as you guys know, but I'd never been on this leg. But infrastructure really helps if you're moving along a certain plane, and in this context, it had robotic up and down, and then we started developing this, notions of adaptive sensing that you do when you are collecting data in sort of somewhat knowable but irregular patterns, and you're not necessarily sampling you don't even know exactly how you should be sampling the environment, but you're driving your analysis and your collection that way. So we were rewarded for letting go of our precious, massively distributed smart dust and moving on to accept what could be relevant components. So from massively distributed, we sort of moved to mobile, and just around that time, the world was very clearly moving to mobile. And so we're at around 2005 initially, and Nokia was the exciting device of the day. Actually, we started with Palm Pilots, and then we moved on to Nokia devices that we could program. And those were the first devices we could actually develop software for and control the sensors, the Bluetooth, which you could get to a GPS, which wasn't even on the device at the time. And we started exploring this idea of participatory sensing and data campaigns, and using, if you will, I don't think the word crowdsourcing existed then, but we were effectively using focused crowdsourcing to gather data about the environment, because you're not going to put out a camera network to notice where people are throwing recyclables into a garbage can, but you can deploy a fleet of your undergrads for a while, for a week on the campus, and tell them every time you pass a trash can, you have this software on your phone, every time you pass a trash can, take a picture of it. And because computer vision wasn't so great at the time, tag it as whether you see a recyclable item or not. And so they did like a data campaign to try to tell the campus where they should put more recycling bins. That is not a killer app. It's just a little mosquito bite problem for which you use this kind of approach. Our ecologists developed something called what's invasive. When you're in natural environments, one of the biggest threats to the natural ecosystem is the incursion of invasive species of plants. And those invasive species of plants take up a lot of the moisture and the nutrients in the soil and crowd out the local flora, which if you lose them, you crowd out the local fauna, and you really begin to have degraded ecosystems. So once again, people who are hiking through Santa Monica and other mountains, right, we had it pull down a map, and we would show people what to look for, the common invasive species. They would take a picture, they would tag it because computer vision wasn't good enough, right? And we would build a map for the Park Service to do that kind of a thing. Quaint now, it was interesting in its time, and started giving us data to try to do computer vision stuff with, and started giving us location traces from that data. So another project we did at the time, another environmentally focused one, was this idea. So we were using all these geocoded images, and we played with a bunch of things on it, including automatically detecting what you're eating during the course of the day with an outward-facing camera hung around your neck, sort of like on one of these lanyards. And I turned out hating the project, which I had begun. But when I was trying it out, I had this long commute. I was in LA, and all of my images were of my steering wheel. I never really take time for lunch, so you would maybe like see an apple coming into the range. And on my laptop, you could read my email on those images. So there was like, okay, many things wrong with this picture, so to speak. And so I said, let's just drop the images, but this time series of location, I have never had that before. So we started like tracing our locations, and you know, I have great, somewhere back in my, this is like pre-Google Slides and stuff, I had these trails of location. One of them was, you could tell it was in Japan because of the writing on the map. And I used to ask people what it was, and then straight down, and it was a climb up Mount Fuji. And then I would ask people what this thing straight down was, and most people would say, somebody would say, oh, it's it's a cable car. There's no cable car taking me down from Mount Fuji. That's like sacrilegious. It was my battery ran out at the top, and so it connected. But this project took your location trace and mashed it up against particulate matter estimations of the region. And so talked about your exposure to PM 2.5, which is largely while you're sitting on the freeway around diesel trucks and such. And also your generation of PM 2.5, which is largely happening every time you're sort of braking and such near schools and going off on those side streets that Google Maps now sends you to. This is pre that. We ventured on from that environmental, largely using these sensors to describe the environment. The minute we started doing that and having these traces, we then started to think about what it tells about that person themselves, and we started exploring this space that came, closer to this thing that's called generally mobile health. And started on Android phones. We called it And Wellness at the time, and it was the ability to sort of script a combination of self-report and passive data collection for individuals, and use those apps as a kind of intervention. That's a decade ago, right? Many fewer people had smartphones, and as we were told by lots of folks at NIH, that I just thought, I got to go tell the NIH about this. Like, this is across all the institutes. This is so relevant. Anyway. That's another story. So one of the things that's fantastic about STCs, I'm referring a little bit back to the governor's talk, is from the beginning they say you are going to do something around education and diversity. And do not bother applying if you're not committed to doing that. And I remember saying, as we were sort of going through the sets of, I got more and more excited about our education and outreach as we were even writing the proposals. And so I felt like, okay, even if we do all the maximum amount of work before failing, I'm glad we spent our time thinking about it. And so participatory sensing and this kind of mobile sensing was just a perfect match for engaging the local community. We did this project with high school students in Boyle Heights, and I think it started in 2009, went on to 2010. Kids did not have smartphones then, by and large, so we gave out boxes of smartphones for them to use with these data campaigns in which they would capture sort of, they were applying for money to build a community center. And the question was, where should it be and what activities would be there? And so the nonprofit that was putting together the proposal used this data campaign to sort of inform their proposal to the foundation that was funding it. And it used both sort of to see what routes they took through that passive sensing, and then there was some geocoded images around who they sort of turned to for school for help, what they ate on the way to school, what they ate for dinner, what interfered with them getting their homework done. I don't know when they disabled App Engine. We built this on App Engine because it was the fast way to do it. It was a Google service. And whenever it was that got disabled, I suddenly found in my personal Google photo stream, and it's still there, it must be in violation of some IRB, all the images that these many tens, like close to 100 residents in Boyle Heights collected. It's all associated somehow with my account, so I'm reminded of it frequently. Okay, so how much time do I have left? 2, okay. So as I told you that I was going to expose you to probably too much nostalgia, I completely did that. So since that time, through that work, we've pursued things around mobile health, around things that not a great term, but my TED-Med handlers in 2013 said it was the best of the things I offered to them as terms. A focus on small data, not instead of big data, but the notion that the data from an individual from many sources over time is very relevant to understanding that individual over time and their health management, and the notion of things like digital biomarkers. And we explore that. Patient-generated health data is another term for it, and we explore the use of that kind of patient-generated health data in the context of clinical care so that your doctor can know whether this new medication or dose of medication or the treatment that you're having after surgery or your physical therapy for a rotator cuff injury, to see whether you're actually making progress, because it shows up in these digital traces for an individual to know that, as well as to contribute to evidence. There's lots of sources of that data, and the difficult part, and where there's still research to do on the combined clinical and data side, is to actually develop these digital biomarkers that can inform personalized care. And this is particularly tricky because it's not going to be the same measure for everybody. You have to size your estimation of somebody's change in mobility, change in socializing, change in their social rhythms relative to them, and not something that the clinical field is particularly used to doing. And let me just, I mentioned TED-Med, and that a lot of the thinking and the inspiration behind that came with a story I told at the time around my father, which I will skip because I only have a minute. And I just want to end by saying I thought when I did that talk and they asked me to do it, that it was too here and now. It was 2013, it was 6 years ago, and I thought it was way too doable to be of interest to something that tends to be a more futuristic platform. And it still isn't happening. And so there could be 2 conclusions to that story. One is it shouldn't happen, right? There's not much value in it. That could be one version of the story. And I think that over the last few years, that's been sort of where I've been going with it. Like, this is just not happening. This must not be worth happening. But patience is something that some of my clinical colleagues like IDSM have been teaching me, and it is now actually slowly starting to happen. We needed all those smartphones to really penetrate so that the full population had them instead of being text message, so we could do it with equity. And we needed all that electronic health record digital infrastructure on the back end to really be there. There are a lot of privacy-related, surveillance-related equity-related issues. What I'm happy to say is that when I started using this slide sometime back, you could still hear a fair amount of nobody cares about privacy anymore, the youth don't care about privacy, and we don't hear that anymore. And thank goodness, because it was never true, and it certainly isn't true now. And so a wonderful piece on this sort of vision that we're trying to realize is what Atul Gawande refers to as the heroism of incremental care. It's not just about surgery and acute treatments. It's about the way most people end up living and suffering and caring for others, and this technology has most relevance there. And thank you to the STC program. It really taught me how to embrace a kind of multidisciplinary, up from theory to applied work, and happy to be doing that now at Cornell Tech, just a train ride away. Thank you.
As the panel comes up and takes their place, maybe there's time for one question.
Deborah, how do you see developments in AI and machine learning helping towards this vision?
So first of all, we needed to use machine learning along the way. So I don't contribute to AI or machine learning, but I'm an avid user. Like, nothing of this works without machine learning. From the earliest activity classifications that we did on accelerometry to now even across the deeper small data, being able to come up with patterns. So it's all machine learning driven. I don't know that it's contributing to machine learning, right? So I don't think it's machine learning research, but it's absolutely applications of machine learning.